She walked down the narrow airplane aisle, holding her small carry-on tight to her chest, her eyes searching for seat 22C. Passengers around her stared, some curious, some whispering, some not even trying to hide their looks. Her clothes were plain, a simple hoodie and worn jeans. Her hair was tucked under a faded cap, and her shoulders were slightly hunched like she was trying to become invisible. As she reached her seat, she heard it. A snort of laughter from a man sitting in 22B. He leaned over to the woman in 22A and whispered something that made both of them chuckle. She stood there for a second, frozen, then quietly slid into the window seat without saying a word. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted to get through the flight without being noticed. But it was already too late. A child a few rows behind her shouted something loud about that strange woman, and someone else added, "Why is she sitting there anyway? She doesn't look like she belongs." She kept her head down, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. Her eyes locked on the clouds outside. The plane hadn't even taken off, and she already wanted to disappear. The flight attendants did nothing. They smiled politely, offered snacks and safety instructions, but no one asked if she was okay. No one noticed the tightness in her jaw, or the way she flinched each time someone brushed past her arm like she carried a disease. She had been through worse. A man a few rows ahead turned to glance at her, then turned back. She recognized the look. She had seen it many times before. Suspicion, judgment, assumptions, all written on his face like a script she could recite in her sleep. As the plane finally took off, the engines roaring beneath them, she closed her eyes and tried to focus on breathing, in and out, calm and steady like she had trained herself. She had to stay calm no matter what. She had a mission. No one knew who she really was. Not the man mocking her. Not the flight attendant who barely looked her in the eye. Not even the pilot who gave the standard welcome message over the intercom. They all saw a quiet, strange woman in seat 22C, but none of them saw the call sign hidden in her encrypted ID card tucked inside her inner pocket. None of them knew what she had done, or what she was capable of. The whispers continued. Some passengers murmuring, others pointing. One even asked the flight attendant to move his seat farther away from her. She heard it all, every word like a tiny pinprick against her skin, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting. It was a long flight, hours still ahead, but her heart was already heavy. She wasn't here to prove anything. She wasn't here to fight or explain, but sometimes the world doesn't give you that choice, and today the sky wouldn't either. Because far above them, a flight path was being monitored. Unusual activity was detected. Someone had recognized her name, not the name the airline had on file, but the encrypted signal that pinged quietly from her clearance file the moment she boarded, and somewhere high above the clouds, Air Force One was about to change course. All because of the woman in seat 22C. But no one on board knew that yet. Not the pilot, not the crew, not the ones laughing at her. But they would soon. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight reached cruising altitude. The engines hummed steadily, and the seatbelt signs faded off. Passengers shifted, unbuckled, reached for snacks or pulled out their devices, but she remained still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed out the window like the clouds held answers only she could see. The whispers hadn't stopped, they'd just grown quieter, heavier, like smoke in the air. Some passengers still threw glances her way, brief and sharp, as if afraid looking too long might curse them. A teenage boy snickered as he walked by to the restroom, bumping her shoulder harder than necessary. She didn't flinch. A flight attendant passed by again. This time more nervous than before, she smiled tightly, asking if the woman needed water, her voice thin and fake, the kind of tone used for someone who might be trouble, not someone who needed kindness. The woman said no softly, then turned back to the window. 32,000 feet above the ground, her presence had triggered something. A forgotten protocol. An emergency ping. A signal buried so deep that only one agency in the world could detect it. And it had. In a heavily guarded command center on the other side of the ocean, a quiet beeping began. Red lights blinking slowly across a black screen. A military officer leaned forward, staring at the data feed scrolling in encrypted symbols. Then back at the name blinking once and then twice and then freezing. A name that wasn't supposed to be active anymore. He reached for the phone, back on the plane. The woman shifted slightly, opening her bag just enough to slide her fingers across a small metal object. Round, polished, and cold, and the token. A reminder, a key. She didn't remove it. She only needed to feel it was still there. It had been 7 years since she last used her call sign. 7 years since that mission. The one that ended with silence, betrayal, and a sealed file that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But someone had reopened it, somewhere behind the clouds. 2 aircraft veered from their original path, silent giants, their engines almost inaudible to commercial planes, and within one of them sat a man who hadn't blinked since hearing her call sign. He tapped the screen in front of him and said one word, "Confirm." Back in seat 22C, the woman finally closed her eyes, not to sleep but to prepare. She didn't know yet what had been activated, but she could feel it. Like the shift in wind before a storm. Her body always knew before her mind did. Suddenly, a soft chime echoed through the plane's speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," the pilot said. "We've been asked to make a slight adjustment in our route due to air traffic control instructions. Nothing to be concerned about, we'll keep you updated." The passengers barely reacted. Most shrugged, some sighed, a few looked annoyed. But she knew that wasn't normal. Commercial flights don't get redirected without warning. Not without a reason. She opened her eyes and glanced around. No one else seemed to notice the tension building in the air. Like static on skin, another chime came, this time more subtle, and she felt her seat vibrate slightly, and not from turbulence, but from a frequency, a private channel. A message meant only for her. Her lips tightened. Her hand moved back into her bag, touching the hidden device just once, and pressing it, a response was sent. And just like that, the mission was back on. Above them, far from view, the unthinkable was happening. Air Force One had received a message it had not received in over a decade, one that required immediate protocol change. They didn't know if it was a threat or a request. All they knew was someone with top clearance level 9 had just responded from seat 22C, aboard a standard passenger flight headed for a quiet destination. And the moment that confirmation came through, the skies began to move. The cabin felt colder now, not because of the altitude, but because something had shifted. Something invisible yet heavy. She sensed it in the way the lights flickered for a moment, in the way the crew now moved with tighter steps, hushed voices, and stolen glances toward her seat. The woman in 22C didn't move, didn't speak, she just breathed slower, deeper, like someone counting seconds before something inevitable. A baby cried in the back row. A man argued softly with the flight attendant about his vegetarian meal being unavailable. Ordinary moments still danced across the cabin. But just above them, not far above them, jets were gliding like shadows through a cloud tunnel, wings sharp and engines whispering like ghosts. These weren't regular escort planes. These were coded interceptors with no flag, no color, and no public flight path. They didn't blink on civilian radar, but the woman in 22C, she felt them arrive, and in a dark satellite coordination room on the East Coast, a classified team stared at a screen that had just confirmed something they weren't ready to believe. An emergency ping from Operation Emberwolf, a mission that had been buried and burned years ago, a mission with only one survivor, her. The last message she ever sent back then carried a code no one had used again. Until today, on this flight at 32,000 feet, somewhere over silent land, she kept her gaze outside, even though her reflection in the window showed the same thing she feared the world would see. The tired eyes of someone who had seen more war than peace, more betrayal than brotherhood, more silence than praise. The passenger beside her, the one in 22B who had earlier laughed, now fidgeted with his seatbelt. He sensed something was off, though he didn't understand why. His eyes kept drifting toward her, then away, nervous, like looking at a ticking clock and not knowing when it might ring. The pilot's voice returned on the speaker, too calm to be real. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing temporary flight adjustments under federal instruction." No one panicked, but curiosity spread like a quiet virus. Heads turned, questions formed in whispers, and for the first time, a few passengers glanced at the woman in 22C with more uncertainty than mockery. Somehow they felt she was the reason, but they didn't know how right they were. Inside her hoodie sleeve was a band, skin-tight and metallic, invisible unless touched a certain way. She slid her thumb against it, triggering a light vibration. One blink, then two. It was like muscle memory. Her fingers moved without thinking, responding to a protocol that hadn't been used in 7 years. A small green dot appeared under the fabric. Code recognized it meant from her past life. She remembered what came next. Interrogation or extraction. Maybe both. She wasn't running anymore. She had no more secrets to keep. But she had questions of her own now. Why now? Why had they activated her signal? What had gone wrong enough for the world's most secure skies to need her again? She looked around at the cabin, at the people who had judged her, laughed at her, ignored her, and now sat near her with growing tension. They had no idea that above them flew the most powerful aircraft in the world. And even that plane had changed its route because of her signal. Air Force One had never broken path for anyone outside the chain of command. But tonight it had, because once, long ago, her name wasn't just a name, it was a call sign. One whispered in operations that never made the news. One written in ink that fades from paper but never from memory. And now that call sign had resurfaced. Not from a war zone, not from a battlefield, but from Seat 22C on a flight filled with strangers. Snacks and silent judgments, and the moment that confirmation hit the network, every system from NORAD to the Pentagon blinked to yellow alert, because if she was back, then something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the woman in Seat 22C wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a message, a warning, and maybe the last defense left in the sky. She finally stood up. It wasn't a dramatic move. No grand announcement, no music, no spotlight. Just a quiet rise from Seat 22C. Her knees steady, her fingers still wrapped lightly around the edge of the seat cushion, as if anchoring her to a past she was preparing to leave behind. The air inside the cabin felt thicker now, like it was carrying weight, pressure that only she could feel. She walked slowly toward the rear lavatory, ignoring the sideways stares from the passengers she passed. The ones who had laughed earlier were now too quiet, their laughter gone, replaced by unspoken questions no one dared ask out loud. A young girl sitting near the aisle caught her eye. Just for a second. The girl didn't look afraid, just curious, her innocent gaze locking with the older woman's tired one. And something passed between them. Something wordless, maybe it was strength. Maybe it was a reminder that the world was still worth protecting. She stepped into the lavatory and locked the door behind her. In the tight space, she removed her hoodie slowly, folding it carefully and placing it on the sink counter, revealing a black inner layer beneath. One that didn't belong to any brand. One that didn't exist in civilian stores. One that had no tag and no serial number. It was armor, not metal, not bulletproof. But something more advanced, flexible and layered with microfilament. Technology most people didn't even know existed yet. She looked into the mirror, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger she hadn't seen in years. "You're late," she whispered to herself, her voice soft and tired, but firm. She reached into her waistband and pulled out the small metal disc, the token from before. Only now it clicked and unfolded into a flat chip-like device. She placed it gently against the wall, and the surface responded with a faint blue pulse. A screen appeared in midair, invisible to anyone else, encrypted and secure. The face on the screen was older, gray-haired, deep-set eyes, uniform neat and pressed, yet there was panic in his expression. "We weren't sure you were still alive," he said without greeting. She didn't answer that part. "What happened?" she asked instead. "There's chatter. Strange signals near DC. We picked up a ghost echo on a secure frequency. Same pattern as Operation Emberwolf. We needed to confirm if it was you," he said quickly, eyes searching hers. "Your code woke up the satellites, and that made Air Force One reroute as protocol." "I didn't send a signal," she said calmly. "But your call sign lit up our secure grid," he replied. "From your exact coordinates." Silence filled the narrow space for a second. Then her jaw tightened. "If I didn't trigger it," she said slowly, "someone else did it for me. That changed everything. Do I need to exit?" She asked. He hesitated. "We don't know yet," he replied. "But someone's watching you, and if it's not us, it's them." The screen faded as quickly as it had appeared. She packed the device, slipped on the hoodie again, and stepped back into the aisle. When she returned to 22C, she saw a flight attendant standing nearby, talking in low tones with a man in a dark suit who wasn't on the original crew manifest. She recognized the type immediately. Sky Marshal, and not just any kind. This one had the alertness of someone trained for classified scenarios. He looked at her, and she gave a nod so small it would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But he saw it. He stepped aside. Passengers looked confused now. The atmosphere had changed completely. The shift was no longer silent. It was visible. Mothers held their kids tighter. Businessmen stopped typing, someone whispered. "Why are there jets outside?" As if finally noticing the shadows dancing beyond the wing. And then it happened. The intercom crackled again. "This is your captain. We've been advised that we'll be receiving an airborne escort until we land due to special clearance on board. Please remain calm." No one understood what it meant, but everyone turned to look at her. She didn't stand this time, she didn't need to. Because for the first time on this flight, they didn't see a poor woman in wrinkled jeans or a strange passenger taking up space in 22C. They saw someone important, someone dangerous, someone they should have never underestimated. She looked out the window again, and this time, the jet flying beside them tilted its wings slightly. A silent salute, one that only a few in the world ever receive. She blinked once, that was all, because she knew now she wasn't alone anymore. The jet outside still flew beside them. Close but quiet, its presence felt more than heard, like a shadow guarding something priceless. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were staring. Some wide-eyed, others holding their breath, as if expecting the woman in seat 22C to suddenly stand and announce who she really was. But she didn't. She sat there, hands calmly resting on her lap, her hoodie sleeve covering the faint glow of the encrypted band beneath, her face unreadable, distant like she was listening to something far away. The man in the dark suit, the air marshal, was still standing near the galley, one hand on his radio, the other near his waist, alert, calm, trained to respond only when needed. But his eyes kept drifting toward her, not with suspicion but respect. He had seen the salute from the escorting jet too, and he knew that gesture wasn't given to ordinary passengers. In the cockpit, the pilot had locked the door twice, triple-checked the emergency codes, and was now staring at a private message blinking on his secured console, one that had only one line. Proceed as instructed. VIP clearance confirmed, Hawaii callsign Revenant. The pilot had flown for over 20 years, but this was the first time he saw that code. He turned to his co-pilot, eyes wide. Do you know who's in 22C? He asked quietly. The younger man shook his head. No one by that name on our manifest, and that's when it clicked. Because there was no one named Revenant on paper. There never had been. That name only existed inside certain files. Files with no titles, no signatures, no traces. Files buried deeper than top secret. Back in the cabin, the woman reached for the cup of water in front of her, took a sip slowly, her eyes scanning the screen across the aisle where a map of the flight path blinked gently, a red line indicating their new route. It curved slightly east and away from their original path. She knew that curve. It wasn't just a change in air traffic. It was a detour for controlled descent, one used when Air Force coordination was involved. They weren't landing where they thought they were landing where she needed to be. Whether she liked it or not, she turned her head slowly. Looking at the people around her, the woman in 22A now stared at her hands, guilt weighing down her shoulders. The man in 22B had stopped pretending to be asleep, his posture stiff, lips tight, his earlier smugness replaced by confusion and a hint of fear. They had judged her for how she looked, for her quietness, for her worn clothes, but they never imagined who she might be when the silence lifted. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was used to people seeing only what they expected to see, but part of her still ached. Not from shame, not from fear, but from memory. Because the last time someone recognized her call sign, it ended in fire and betrayal. She closed her eyes and remembered the mountain base, the blizzard, the extraction point that never came, the voice in her ear saying abort mission, but she hadn't, because a child was still inside, and she never left children behind. That was the day she died officially, that was the day her name was erased. And Revenant was born a ghost, a myth. But ghosts don't fly commercial, unless they want to be seen, and now someone had forced her back into the light. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin chip, barely thicker than a fingernail, black, smooth, cold. She placed it gently on the fold-down tray and tapped it once. The chip blinked red, then green, and somewhere, in a satellite 200 miles above Earth, a door opened, not a real door, and a digital one that only she had the key to. Her job wasn't done, not yet, because something worse than betrayal was happening, and she could feel it. Something was being buried again, and this time she wouldn't stay silent. Not from seat 22C, not from the shadows of her past, not with the world watching her from both the clouds and the ground. She slid the chip back into her pocket and leaned her head back against the seat. Outside, the escort jet remained steady, and somewhere far ahead, Air Force One began to descend toward the same destination, its own path changed by the return of a ghost. The landing was quieter than expected. The passengers, once buzzing with conversation and confusion, now sat stiff in their seats watching every move of the crew. The captain's voice came on again, smooth but nervous, informing everyone that the flight would be arriving at a temporary military-controlled zone due to airspace adjustments. No one believed it was routine anymore. The woman in 22C hadn't said a word in hours, yet somehow her silence had reshaped the entire flight. She hadn't yelled, hadn't flashed a badge, hadn't made a scene. She didn't need to. Even the sky bent around her now. The plane touched down on a runway that didn't show up on any passenger's map. It wasn't a commercial airport. There were no terminals, no blinking signs or baggage carts waiting nearby. Instead, rows of black SUVs and uniformed personnel lined the runway's edge. A low hum of aircraft engines could still be heard overhead. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the passengers pressed their faces to the windows. Staring out at the armed figures and unmarked vehicles, the engines powered down, and an eerie silence filled the cabin. Then the door opened, and the stairs were lowered, not the usual jet bridge, but metal steps straight to the tarmac. The air marshal appeared again, this time speaking to the flight crew in low tones, his eyes darting toward 22C. The captain stepped out from the cockpit, which almost never happened, and made his way down the aisle. Everyone watched him stop at her row. She looked up at him calmly. "Ma'am," he said, voice respectful, almost careful. "They're here for you." She nodded once and stood, no suitcase, no purse, nothing but the folded hoodie she tucked under her arm. Her walk was calm, not rushed, not nervous, just steady, like someone returning to a place they never thought they'd see again. As she reached the aircraft door, two men in gray suits waited at the bottom of the steps, their posture firm. Their eyes locked on her. She stepped down. One of them spoke, "Welcome back." Revenant, she didn't respond, not yet behind her. Passengers pressed against the windows, their earlier judgment now replaced by something else. Awe. Maybe shame, maybe both. They saw the woman they had laughed at, and they saw the black SUV doors open for her like they would for heads of state. They saw soldiers straighten their backs as she passed. They saw aircraft lights blink in pattern, two short, one long, the old clearance signal used for high-value extraction. And they finally understood. She was someone the world had buried on purpose, and now she was unburied. The vehicle door closed behind her, sealing out the noise, sealing in a different kind of silence. The silence of secrets resurfacing. Inside, a folder sat on the seat beside her. Thin but heavy, she opened it slowly. Inside were satellite images, encrypted data, a list of locations, and 3 names she thought she'd never hear again. At the bottom of the file was a timestamp, one that matched the moment her call sign lit up the grid from seat 22C. She leaned back, staring at the information, her heartbeat steady, her breathing slow. They hadn't activated her. Someone else had, someone from inside, using her code as bait, someone who wanted her seen. Whoever it was, and they knew she wouldn't ignore the signal. They had forced her out, and now the game had started again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Air Force One had landed minutes earlier at the adjoining hangar, and someone from the highest level of command was already waiting to meet her. Not to question her, but to ask for her help. Because the threat wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was within the system that once built her, betrayed her, erased her, and she was the only one who had ever survived it. The SUV pulled away from the tarmac, escorted by armored vehicles front and back, drones hovering above, and somewhere deep inside the operations center, a screen flashed her call sign again. Revenant, the ghost who never stayed dead. And now she was done hiding. The room was colder than she remembered, not in temperature but in energy. It was one of those steel-lined, underground briefing rooms with no windows, no clocks, and no names, a place where truth was told in pieces and lies were dressed in uniforms. She sat at the end of the long metal table, alone for now, the file still open in front of her, the names still staring back at her like ghosts she hadn't buried deep enough. Footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond, heavy boots mixed with soft shoes, officers in suits, protocol and politics coming together when a problem became too big to hide. She didn't flinch when the door opened. 3 men entered first, 2 generals and 1 national security advisor. Their eyes held the weight of sleepless nights and broken systems, but it was the woman who entered behind them that made her raise an eyebrow ever so slightly. A uniform, crisp and decorated with a familiar scar above her left brow. They had served in the same region once before everything went wrong. Before the silence, before the cover-up. Now they were face to face again. "Revenant," the woman in uniform said quietly, "or do you want your real name back now?" She gave a faint smirk, then shook her head. Let's stick to the one they remember. They sat. The general slid another folder toward her. This one thicker, with real photos and not satellite shots. Not heat scans but images taken on the ground of a facility not marked on any map. A place that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. They've restarted it, one of the generals said. We shut it down, but someone turned it back on. Under a different name, different funding trail. Same objective. She flipped through the pages without blinking. Biotests, AI target training using human profiles. Civilian surveillance run through unauthorized neural networks. And at the very end, in her name, her signature from 7 years ago. Copied onto a document she never signed. They're framing me, she said flatly. They're calling you rogue, the security advisor admitted. And trying to erase the original mission logs, she closed the file and looked straight at them. Then why bring me back in? Because only one person walked out of the original base alive, the advisor replied. And only one person got close enough to shut it down before. Silence hung in the room like dust. She stood, walked over to the large screen on the wall, and pointed to a grainy image, one of the main labs. Heavily guarded, I can get in, she said. We know, the uniformed woman replied. We just didn't think you'd ever agree to. I'm not doing it for you, she said softly. I'm doing it because I know who they'll hurt next if no one stops them. The generals exchanged looks. What do you need? 2 things, she replied. First, access to the full Ember Wolf logs, the unedited ones including black file footage. And second, I choose the team. The room paused. Then nodded. The agreement was quiet but final. They knew better than to question her methods. Not after what she'd already done for them, and for the country that had once forgotten her name. An hour later, she stepped out of the facility under heavy escort. But not as a prisoner. This time she walked like a commander. The black SUV door opened again, but this time she climbed into the front seat. No one laughed now. No one whispered behind her back. Because her presence was no longer a mystery. It was a warning, and the world above. The people who had watched her step onto that plane from seat 22C would never know how close they'd flown to the edge of history. They'd return home and tell stories of the strange woman who changed everything mid-air. Of jets in the sky, of soldiers on the runway. But they'd never know the real reason it all happened. Only that the quiet woman in the hoodie had once been humiliated by glances and murmurs, but had risen without speaking, without defending herself because she didn't need to be seen to be powerful. She was never just a passenger. She was a shadow that moved through systems, a name spoken in back rooms. And when the world forgets people like her, it's only because someone wanted them forgotten. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. And now that she had risen again, they'd never be able to put her back in the dark, not this time, not ever again.